My name is Jason. I'm 25 years old and I am from Ohio. I have one unbelievable, terrifying story. But despite how many times I've been telling the same story to my friends and family, no one doesn't even believe me. Except for two of the people who were there with me that evening. My 25-year-old fiancée Daniela and my 24-year-old cousin Tony. This actually took place around December 2022, so only a few months ago. It really shook all of us up. But before I make it into the story, what actually happened, let me like a brief backstory about me and Daniela. I actually I'm from a small town in Ohio, and Daniela was actually from the same town. I mean, when I say small town, you may think like a small country type, but this town had maybe around 20,000 people. So even despite it's a small town, but I actually met her during my first year of college, and we did start dating until like the second year, and we actually probably became engaged or during our senior year. I'm actually working as mechanic, and she works at a pet shop. And we actually had a good time. We had actually been start move in together shortly after college. But anyways, that was a part of the brief backstory. And like I said, this happened during the 27th December of 2022, which only about a few months ago. But here is the story. This happened just around near the end of December of 2022. One day when I was at home, I got a call from my cousin Tony, who lives in West Virginia. Tony was actually only 1 year younger than myself, so he was just around 24 years old. I wasn't expecting a call from my cousin, but he asked me how I was doing and just normal chit chat. But then he told me that he would like to see me over Christmas. He was inviting me to spend Christmas with him. Since, well, he said that Daniela is also welcome to join us. After all, she was well beloved by my whole family, included the extended one. But I told Tony that I can't make this choice my own. I needed to talk to her first, and since I didn't want to make it right out of blue decision, because I don't know how she would become angry or not. So he had to stand, and I told him that I will call him later that evening. After that, Daniela came home in the evening. We had dinner. I told her about this, that Tony called me, and that he invited us to spend the Christmas with him. She was actually in for the idea, and I told her I didn't want to telling him that we are coming without informing her. Since I actually own my own car in my mechanic shop, so I can close down for about a weekend for the holiday. And since Daniela was actually going to have her 2 weeks winter holiday from work, so it fit perfectly well for us. So I gave Tony a call that same evening that we are coming over to spend at least until New Year's Eve, and he was quite excited. So the day when we were leaving, we decided to drive. But since it's 4 hours drive over between Ohio and West Virginia, so we decided to start driving around early morning. So we would arrive there maybe as early afternoon. We just talked around on the ride until Daniela fell asleep in the car, but I don't mind. And even though I was a bit tired myself, but it wasn't like maybe around, I would say maybe noon when I was actually full awake. Sure, we did stop on a couple of times during the ride to either refill the car or to stretch our legs and just something like that. But when we finally arrived at Tony's house on the countryside outside of the small town when he was living, we were actually quite excited. He had already put up some of the decorations on the house, which he always does, and we actually had a good time. Since we had arrived in the early afternoon, I will say 1 p.m. or something like that, so we drove into town just to walk around, to do some window shopping and just something like that. And during the time, Tony asked me, like, how were things going between me and Daniela when, if we had set a date for our wedding yet? Since we had only been engaged for about maybe 2 years or so, I told him that we hadn't even set a date yet, but we had talked about it, but we haven't officially decided at the moment. But he asked about how it was going between us otherwise. I said, it's going great. I mean, who would even have one a lady like her? And even though it was supposed to just a statement just to him, but she overheard that and just like, oh, so I am just like that for you? She laughed. You know what I mean? She nodded. So the rest of the afternoon, we actually had a great time. I mean, we went back to his house, played some cards, and just had some coffee, and after, I think maybe just around 11 p.m., Daniela went to bed since she was quite tired after a long day. But me and Tony, we decided to stay up a little bit longer. We were actually watching a movie and having some beers and just having a guy night, to say. But since, I mean, this was probably one of the best times that I had with Tony in a couple of years, since, I mean, I hadn't seen my cousin Tony in a few years. But not because that I didn't have to choose. Because first I was in college, and college took a lot of time, like exams and all that stuff. And then after that, I started working a mechanic, and since I opened my own shop, I had to build it from the scratch and hire some people and just, had to try to figure out what the next step would be. I mean, I wanted to have it to make sure that my business was going well, and then I had to end up being failure. But anyways, since the Christmas was just about a week away, so the next day, Daniela took the car and drove into town to do some last Christmas shopping while me and Tony were still at the house. He still had some decorations that he hadn't been able to be put up since he needed some extra help. Since he had his dad to help him the last time, but since his dad was out of town for a moment. So, and we put up some of those decorations and we went inside, just talked, and around the time in the afternoon when Daniela was actually coming back home with some of the gifts that she had already wrapped in, and we decided to put out the tree already. But it's just one small detail that Tony forgot to mention. That he normally has a plastic tree, but he realized that he had thrown it away because it turned out that the tree had been damaged during a move. So he wanted to ask us if we wanted to have a real tree this year. I mean, even when I was just a kid, I always had a real tree with my family, and so did Daniela. So we actually said, why not? A real tree wouldn't be such a bad choice. So we decided to go in the woods the next day to cut down the tree on Tony's property. Tony actually owned a small property in the forest that it was next to his house. So it wouldn't be given any problems if someone caught us. Well, if they did, Tony would explain that they are actually on his property, on his land. So, well, the next day, we were actually decided to go into the woods sometimes in the afternoon, but we didn't know exactly where to look. First, we needed one thing: the axe. Tony said he had an axe, but it was somewhere in the garage, so we had to look and look. He had a lot of stuff in there. Like, he had his motorbike and a few boxes, and I was like, Tony, you really need to clean up more often in here. It's like you want soon, one day you won't be able to find your own motorcycle. He was like, yeah, probably. But after a few mental searching, we found the axe. And so, well dressed for warm, because this day it was a little bit colder than usual. I mean, West Virginia can be a little bit colder otherwise. And so we decided to walk off in the woods to find a perfect tree. Sure, we did find several trees, but some of them we didn't like. That some that Tony liked, but I didn't like it otherwise because it was too tall for the house. I was like, Tony, that one is way too tall for your house. Do you want me to cut a hole for the house? And he was like, probably not. Then Daniela found one tree, but then I was like, Daniela, that is like what, 3 feet tall? Is it a little bit too short for one? She laughed and said she was only joking about it though, but she said, in a few years maybe this could have been a perfect tree otherwise. And I was like, yeah, if you want to stay here, wait till the next few years. She laughed and said like, oh you crazy maniac, but she was joking about it though. But we kept walking through the forest and we actually didn't find any particularly good tree on his property. So I was like, what are we going to do? So, but we decided to continue the next day. But we had actually been out almost the entire afternoon at the time. We wasn't even back to the house around maybe almost 5 p.m. But we were still deep in the part of the woods, and it was like 4:30 p.m. and it was getting dark. And suddenly, and we were almost like maybe only a few, maybe not that far from the house, when we suddenly heard this crawling sound. We all stopped. Wait, did you guys hear that? Said Daniela. Yeah, without a doubt, I said. I wonder what it could have been. But then Tony said, oh, that's the bloodless howler, he said. The bloodless howler? I asked. You never heard of the bloodless howler? I shook my head and Daniela said the same. Well, Tony explained that the bloodless howler was a local cryptid in town. And I was like, a cryptid? Like you mean like a Bigfoot? Kinda, but there's a crypt doesn't mean just about Bigfoot, he said. So, he described this creature to be as white as snow and had a body of a canine and a head almost like a lion. What? A body of a canine, I mean, as a dog and a head of a lion? That makes no sense. There is no way for that type of animal to exist, I told him. But that's probably just what? Maybe a bear that just have been woken up in the middle of this hibernation? Which is really not uncommon, but I said, if there's not a wolf, maybe a bear, but just probably a wolf. That maybe it's just far away and the sound was distorted out a bit in the distance. Daniela thought maybe it was a wolf. But Tony said, no, that's definitely the bloodless howler. But we didn't hear much more of the sound, so we brushed it off and went back to the house. But the thought of this bloodless howler, after both Daniela and Tony went to bed, I was still up. So I searched it online by using Tony's computer, just bloodless howler West Virginia, and I actually found some web pages that on Google that said some of the people actually encountered the bloodless howler, and I was like, there's no way this kind of creature exists. But I thought, since people claim to have seen this since the early 1900s or so, I was like, well, That what people said about Bigfoot since the 1800s. So I was like, maybe there is something, maybe perhaps it isn't that. But the next day, me, Tony, Daniela decided to go a little bit deeper in the woods. So we decided to bring with us some snacks and even something to drink, just in case that we would be gone all day again. But this time we brought flashlights, which we didn't last night. Well, the day yesterday. But as we had this bad luck, for an entire almost afternoon, we didn't find a single good tree, or at least that we couldn't actually agree on. But then, it wasn't until like 4 p.m. when we all found a perfect tree. Perfect height, perfect size, so we cut down with the axe and we started pulling it back with the house. But as it was getting closer to almost dark, we weren't back in the house probably almost past 5 p.m. And it's like, well, at least we had flashlights this time, but this, I believe, was maybe 4:30 p.m. or so ish. I heard it, the same sound that I heard the day before. Tony, is that the real the Bloodless howler? I told him. I asked him. He stated that this definitely were the Bloodless howler. But I told him, how could you know for sure? He told me that this is not the first time he actually heard the sound of it. He told me that he has been hearing the Bloodless howlers howling like that for a number of years now. But always in distance from the house. Not ever has never came any close to his. For no reason. But as the sound continued, it suddenly stopped, and we were probably like maybe halfway through the house when suddenly heard the howl, but this time it wasn't even that far away. It sounded as if it was like just behind us. And as we both, all of us stopped, I took my flashlight and looked for the forest just to be sure there wasn't anything there. Like I was hoping to expect to see a wolf. But when my light hit something white, I would say it was big. I don't know exactly. I think maybe 4 or 5 feet tall from his shoulders, and it was like a lion, but it wasn't. It made this howl. I told everyone to just stop, stand still, but Daniela was like, we should run, and we can't outrun that one, I told them. But Tony said, we have no other ways to do it. I mean, we can barely do anything to harm this. What do you mean? And they told me that's supposed to be a bulletproof. I was like, a bulletproof cryptid? That's insane. But I told Daniela and Tony, leave the tree and ran as fast as you can back to the house. I will be right behind them. So they did. They dropped the tree and took off. This Bloodless howler didn't even do that. It stood behind at the same spot, hadn't even moved. I screamed at it and leave us alone, and wielding the axe in the air, saying, if you get near me, I will cut your head off. But it didn't even budge. So I took off after Diana and Tony. And in fact, I was so scared. I was almost like shaking my booth off. We got back to the house, but I was really scared of what to do next. So we were so scared, but when we were in the house, we talked about this, and I asked them, did we actually see what we thought we saw? They all both agreed that we did see West Virginia's own Bloodless howler. So they thought it wasn't worth to go back for the tree. But the next day, when Tony and Daniela were actually in town for doing some shopping, I actually went back to the place where I found where we last saw the Bloodless howler. I brought my camera to break some photos of the footprints. Luckily though, I did find some good footprints. But even though that despite I showed this to my friends and family back home, they still doesn't believe me. They thought maybe that was just someone faked it, or it just must have been a canine, or maybe just a bit slight larger wolf. But I know exactly what I saw. But anyways, I went back there. I found a tree on the same place as we dropped it. I picked it up and carried it back to the house. When Daniela and Tony saw the tree, they were like stunned. I actually was brave enough to even went back there. I even showed them the photos of the footprints. It stood there and then walked off back in the woods. But that was the only time I ever saw the Bloodless howler. But during our staying there, we did hear it for a couple of times at night when we were staying there. But other than that, we didn't see it, but just heard it. Me and Daniela was just happy that it didn't attack us. Because when I told her that it wouldn't even had eaten us, only drink our blood. That is what only, like a vampire almost. So after New Year's Eve, we said goodbye to Tony and thanked him for the hospitalities. That hopefully we can bring him back there, or he could come to see us for a holiday or something. He said that he would probably try to get there to us to see us next time. But when we did get back home, I actually went to see my parents, show them the photo, and tell them the story. But they told me that Tony has always been having this great accent, had his always imaginations to being the fantasy to just made up some stories. But haven't they explained that I saw the same thing with Tony and Daniela? But they have no explanation. Like, if we were doing something like taking some hard drugs to be have the same hassle to be seeing the same thing, which unlikely since I never do drugs, and what doesn't Daniela or Tony. And we weren't even high or drunk that day. So my parents doesn't even believe me, despite I show the photos and tell my story. But they just brush it off. When I told my friends about it, all of them except a few actually believed me. And turned out, one of my friends was a big fan of the cryptids. He told me that he had believed in cryptids since he was a kid, like Bigfoots, Mothman, and many more, like Chupacabra or other places. When I told him about this, he asked if I still had a photo, and I did. I showed it to him, and he told me that he had footprints of many known canines in North America, like coyotes, wolves, mountain lions, all kinds of, even cat animals. But according to this, none of those footprints didn't match that I found. So it had to be an actual proof that the Bloodless howler do exist. But many people doesn't believe that the cryptids are even real. But from that day on, I strongly believe, like my friend, that the cryptids do exist. Even Daniela had become a strong believer herself, but she is from time doesn't want to even go back there to see Tony, that she wants only him to come back to see us from now on. But who knows, maybe one day we might go back there, but let's hope we never see that white blood-sucking bloodless howler ever again.